So, now, I want to welcome you to our Friday Night Lecture Series, sponsored by the Scandinavian Heritage Foundation and the Department of World Languages and Literature here at Portland State. Our speaker tonight is William Sullivan. He's a 5th generation Oregonian, and that makes him absolutely 100%. I have never met anybody who goes that far back, five generations in Portland, here in Oregon. Sullivan earned an English degree at Cornell University, and he studied linguistics in Heidelberg. At Heidelberg, Deutsches Paradies. And he completed a master's degree in German literature at the University of Oregon. Our speaker is the author of 12 non-fiction books and 3 non-fiction about travel, history, and hiking. He and his wife also built the wilds of the Oregon Coast Range. It took them 25 years. And on back-to-earth adventure, felling trees with a crosscut saw. The whole cabin was built by hand. Sullivan is a man on many parts. He's an avid hiker who began his hiking career at the age of 5. You know, Mozart also started playing the piano at 5. You have to start early to become really good at it. And he has been exploring new trails ever since, leading hiking trips all over the States and beyond. He also promotes libraries and helped with the campaign to build the Eugene New Library, and is a member of the Oregon State Library Board, and is vice president of the Lane Library League, a citizen group whose purpose is extending library services to 90,000 Lane County residents who lack service. Sullivan toured Scandinavia 7 times, I'm a Scandinavian, to research his book, The Ship in the Hill, a historical novel based on the true story of a Viking ship dated from a Norwegian farm in 1904. In his slideshow tonight, we will take a ferry to Norway's North Cape, to a medieval village on a Swedish island, and see a reconstructed village in Denmark. So, let us welcome William Sullivan.
Well, thank you all for coming. I guess there's nobody of Scandinavian background in the Portland area, right? Certainly I have a bit, but my wife has much more. Her grandparents were the Sorensens of Portland, and so they were always at the Danish Christmas tree. And that's one reason I got interested in this subject, because it's not, most people don't think of this as being my forte. I'm known as kind of the hiking guy, and I've written a lot of nonfiction books about Oregon outdoors and adventure. But this one was one that I really wanted to write because it said something about my family and my wife's family and our background. Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's turn out the lights. So I thought I'd first tell you a little bit about myself to explain why this maybe seems unusual that I'm writing about Scandinavia. Whoops.
You want it on more?
Yeah, back
The light back there? I can get used to that.
Papa's going to worship us.
So I'm best known across the country as the man who walked 1,000 miles across Oregon one summer to visit all the wilderness areas so I could write a guidebook about them. And to do this, I walked from the westernmost point of Oregon alone with a backpack through 18 wilderness areas to the easternmost point in 2 months. And along the way, I kept a journal of all my adventures. So down here is where I was held at gunpoint by marijuana growers. And up here I poisoned myself with mushrooms. Great idea in the wilderness. And I wound up hiking 40 miles a day through Hell's Canyon, trying to outrun these October snowstorms. This book has kind of become a classic. It was chosen one of Oregon's 100 books. But to this amazes me that people read this and it makes them want to go hiking. I think it scared them away. My other memoir is the story of the log cabin that was just mentioned, that my wife and I built by hand out on this remote property in the Coast Range that you have to hike in 1.5 miles to get to. There is no road there. Even today, no way to get there except by walking. And so we built the cabin using only hand tools, a crosscut saw and an axe, partly to prove you could still do it the pioneer way, and partly because we were broke. So it's an adventure story about building the cabin. But then I have 2 books about Oregon history. This is part of being that 5th generation Oregonian. It goes back a long ways on before skipping back to Denmark. And this is the human history of the state, starting with the very first people that lived in a cave in the desert 14,000 years ago, and the Indian legends, the explorers, wagon trains, and how to go find those places so you could go see what it looks like today. And this is the natural history. Floods, fires, earthquakes, volcanoes, and yes, I do explain what causes these gigantic earthquakes and tsunamis that just hit Japan and are coming to Oregon. We know this because the stumps are on the beach from the last earthquake and tsunami. I always wondered how those trees grew underwater. All up and down the Oregon coast at low tide, you see the stumps of a forest. The earthquake dropped the coast 10 feet and the tsunami cut off the trees, and they're still there. So we have a lot to learn about our own natural history, and that's what I talk about in that book. And then my hiking guides. I have hiked every trail I could find in Oregon, and I update these every single year. And I actually give away a free copy to anybody who finds a mistake. So if you're welcome to look. But I divided the state up into 5 regions, so the red book is kind of the one closest to Portland. But I also have books that cover all of Oregon, and this is kind of hiking light. The easy, pretty trips and trails throughout the whole state, including also bed and breakfasts and hot springs, and it's, my kids call it the wussy hiking guide. And then my latest is a collection of my newspaper columns. For 20 years I've written newspaper columns about Oregon outdoors, and this is a collection of favorite stories and places. Then I have 3 novels, and my first is a historical novel set in Pioneer, Oregon, and it is 95% true. It's based on the life of Joaquin Miller, the wildest pioneer I could find in Oregon's history. He became world famous as a cowboy poet, but had trouble here in Oregon because it turns out he had in fact shot a sheriff and had 2 wives at once. And when she found out about the Indian family in the woods, she was not at all pleased. So they have a museum about him in Eastern Oregon, and it's kind of a Wild West shoot 'em up, a lot about Oregon. My other novel here is a little bit lighter. This is a light mystery based on the premise that Albert Einstein might have left half of a missing formula in his violin case. You know, he played the violin. He had a Stradivarius. It's in a museum, but no one knows what happened to the case. So I have the case turned up in an attic in Oregon. 2 school teachers sell it on eBay, and then they're chased through Europe by spies who really want the rest of the formula. So it's kind of an excuse to take you on a romp through Europe, and it's, well, it is light. It's a book to take to the beach. It's kind of fun. And, which shows that Einstein was not all serious, and that's true too. So these are some of the places that I had to go visit in order to research that book about Einstein. And it was kind of the same problem with the ship on the hill. I had to take 7 trips to Scandinavia and visit all these Viking sites so I could have the research to do this book properly. And so that's what I want to take you on a tour of right now, is the research. And what really got me interested in this, other than all these relatives in Scandinavia, we stopped in Oslo, and everybody that goes to Oslo visits the Viking Ship Museum. It's like the #1 thing to do. And they said, oh yeah, this ship was found in a hill 5 miles from the ocean, and it was buried for a woman. Now both of those things are puzzling, because first, why would you put a ship in a hill? And second, most people didn't think at that time, when they found this ship in 1904, that women were even allowed on Viking ships. So here is the most elaborate Viking grave of all time, and it's not for a king. It's for some woman. Who is this person? And so I learned Old Norse and translated the sagas about this ship in order to find out the story. There is a saga about this queen who is buried in a hill in a ship. And it's a very short saga, because they wrote long sagas about the men. but rather short ones about the women, except this was a very, very interesting saga. It was about a princess who did not want, well, yeah, a girl who did not want to be queen. This was in the 800s, and start of the Viking Age. The king of the Vikings asked to marry her, and she said, no, I'm not going to marry you. You guys are pirates. I'm not going to marry some barbarian. So he came over and slaughtered her whole family and kidnapped her and brought her back. And at that point she said, okay, I will be the queen of the Vikings, but I will also destroy you. And it took her 3 generations to do it, but she did. Her grandson defeated the Vikings, sent them to Iceland, and brought peace to Norway. And this is why her grave is the most important Viking grave of all time. She was the one that stopped the Vikings, defeated them. And when you look at the materials in their grave, and all these things you've been seeing were from the ship, there's no swords, there's no weapons. It's a woman's grave. It has a bed. It has artwork. These posts that were on your throne, your chair of power. It had sleds and wagons. And it had tapestries, too. Weaving things, looms. It was a woman's grave. And that really puzzled people here in 1904 when they found this, because that was the year before women were allowed to vote in Norway. It was a time of a tipping point. Both in 1904, just as women were about to get the vote, and 1,000 years earlier, when a woman is kidnapped and vows to destroy the men that did this. The ship had to be dismantled and preserved in Oslo. Here's what was left of the tapestries, the only tapestries found in Scandinavia. And look, they've reconstructed here what they were about. It's a parade. There's no ships anywhere in her artwork, this queen. They are celebratory, peaceful scenes. And runes as well. And that was part of the puzzle. What do these runes mean? They're the only runes found in this grave. So I think they're rather important. And so I analyzed them in the book as well. So now to research Vikings, I needed to do more than just visit this one burial site, which is about 50 miles southwest of Oslo in Tønsberg, a little village called Åsberg. I wanted to visit a lot of other sites because I needed to know background about what kind of people these were. Our image of the Vikings is of bloodthirsty barbarians, and it's true that's what the English saw. That's what Scandinavian exported, were bloodthirsty Vikings who killed people and stole things. And that's what we remember because a lot of our history is from the victims, from the English and the French. And we don't get that many stories from the home field here. And so this is the Viking meet, the Viking in near Aarhus in Denmark every summer. And people from all over the world get together and play Viking for a while. And have battles, and I got to sail on a ship there at this meeting, but that's only one weekend a year. If you want to see what Viking life was like and do it in Denmark or nearby, then you should go to Hedeby. And this is the German Heitabu. It now is on the German side of the border. They've moved the border. But it was a Danish Viking town. And they've excavated this, and it was actually one of the very first cities in all of the north. They built this wall around it and have a dock here, and then found all of these houses and little streets. And so they found a few ships out in the harbor too, and have reconstructed them and done little dioramas so you can get a feel of what life was like. These were traders. They traded a lot in manufactured goods, but mostly in slaves. This was a problem with the Vikings. They did travel a lot and came back with slaves. That was a valuable thing. Our whole word for slaves comes from Slav, because they conquered and established Russia, and I'll talk about that at the end of this. Hadebu here in far northern Germany was the first town in the north to mint its own money, and on the coins they have a symbol of a ship. The sea level is not quite the same as it was back then, but it was shallow, and this was useful. The Viking ships only drew 6-12 inches of draft, so they could sail up basically any river in Europe. And this is why they were so phenomenally successful as raiders, because those ships, the cities, Paris, London, had been defended by big walls, but there was no defense at all against the river because it was a shallow river. Nobody could get it. And suddenly the Vikings would show up with 20,000 men on the river in a matter of an hour. And so basically there was no defense in Europe against this kind of attack. Hadebu, they reconstructed a lot of the buildings, and here's an example of tents and some of their fishing gear. And they did have an open hearth in the middle of the house with a smoke hole up there, benches that you could sleep on, woven willow fences, lots of places. There's a woman spinning wool, and these brooches are really typical. You had to have those if you were a woman in Denmark. The other thing you needed was a key. That was a badge of your rite of passage from a girl to a woman. When you got married, you got a key, because girls owned nothing, not even their own clothes. They were not allowed to own anything. And as a woman, they were given a chest with a key, and then they had possessions, and they were the chieftain of their home, and so that key meant a lot. And we did find chests and keys in the Viking ship. To see more of in Denmark itself, you need to go. This is Fåborg on the island of Fyn, and it's a cuter town than Copenhagen. But you need to go to Copenhagen because that's where the big museums are in Copenhagen. And all of the museums in Denmark are free. They're all subsidized by the government, open doors for everybody for free. The Nationalmuseet has a fantastic display of early Viking and pre-Viking Norse goods. This sun chariot found in a farmer's field, and the silver bowl this big with the gods of the Norse deities Odin and Thor. And these horns, which actually are replicas, the originals were stolen and melted down, and these have been now replaced, found in the field there. But there were lots of these trumpets, these lure horns, that were used in ceremonies, and of course masses of loot. Every year when they went to England, they didn't immediately. The first few years they just looted, but after that they got wise. The Vikings said, okay, well, we could loot and kill you all, or you could give us a boatload of silver. Which would you rather? And so every year they got a boatload of silver, and there are hoards of this silver all over Scandinavia brought back from England. Here we see again these brooches, and they did do weapons. Every warrior had to make his own shield. That was part of your training, so that you couldn't blame anybody if it broke. Had games, chess, and an earlier game here, Toffel. Now we want to go up to sort of the Viking homeland here, Oslo. Let's go up to Norway. And Oslo itself is kind of a dark and dreary city to me, my mind. I think the other towns in Norway are more fun. And so I recommend getting on the train here and riding the train, the Bergenbanen, over to Bergen, the second largest city in Norway. This train goes clear up over the mountains, this Hardangervidda, which is a plateau. The high country in Norway doesn't have peaks that stick up like this. It's capped with ice. And the glaciers then cover all the high ground and leave these huge lakes and moors, and then crash down into fjords on the west side. very dramatic landscape. And you can ride this train. It's like, takes half a day to get from Oslo to Bergen and see it all. And if you want, you can get out at that high country and visit some of these early homesteads. This probably dates to the 1300s, 1400s, and has now been restored as a stopover for hikers. If you want, you can hike from homestead to homestead, and the Norwegian Hiking Club will give you a key, and you can unlock the doors and then go in and take whatever food you want and leave money on the honor system, and then hike on to the next place. Then when you get down to Bergen, on the second largest city on the Atlantic there, it actually is a fun town. It's quaint. It reminds me, kind of a Seattle without the skyscrapers or something. With the mountains coming right down to it. But in Bergen, you can also take a ferry to Iceland. For Icelanders, and there are only, what, 200,000, 300,000 Icelanders altogether in the whole country, Bergen is the big city nearby. And so they'll drive over to the ferry and take this ferry for 2 days and go to Bergen to go shopping. And so the ship is owned and run by Icelanders. They use Icelandic money in their... But you don't have to go all the way to Iceland. You can stop at they stop at the Shetland Islands on the way. So my wife and I did that because we wanted to sort of follow the Vikings toward Scotland. So it's only a day on the ferry over to the Shetlands. It's not a cruise ship that you're on here. But when you get to the Shetlands, then this is a place with no trees, lots of birds. We took another ferry then on to the Orkney Islands, which both of these are now owned by Scotland, even though they were Viking for centuries. And Orkney is a little bit warmer, a little more lush, and you'll find museums with Viking treasure here as well. And also there's some pre-Viking things here in Orkney. Out there in the heather is a ring of standing stones that's pretty much the size and shape of Stonehenge and dates to the same era, but is done a little less fancy because they didn't have quite the same stones there, I guess. But they are in a giant circle and aligned with the solstice, and these date to about 2000 BC. So they're a long time before the Vikings. But here in one of these grave mounds that are from 2,000 to 3,000 BC, they're the best preserved Viking ruins anywhere in the British Isles. And you wonder how that could be. Maybe this gave them some of the ideas for burying their ships, too. They have this gigantic burial mound that's thousands of years old. Well, the entrance to it is a shaft that is aligned exactly with the summer solstice. And so the sun will shine down that shaft, and they take tours down in the shaft. You can crawl down into the center of the mound. And when you get to the center of the mound, you'll find these runes in there. And when you read the runes, it says that it was a group of Vikings who were, in about the year 800, that were sailing past these islands in a storm and pulled in there because the storm was so terrible and it just kept raining and raining, so they dug their way into this mound and spent 3 days here bored to death. And they have a lot of time on their hands, and so they carved these runes telling their whole story in there. So it's kind of wild to have the best preserved Viking runes in this island in Orkneys in a burial mound from thousands of years earlier. Now I want to jump over to Sweden, and we'll start here in Stockholm. And from Stockholm, I want to take you on another ferry, love ferries anyway, but this one goes to Gotland. And Gotland is an island that's maybe 40 miles long, and it was very popular with the Vikings. The Vikings loved islands. They were a ship-based culture. And so they felt secure on an island because they had the world's greatest fleet. Nobody could attack them on an island. And Gotland was kind of the place where Vikings went to retire. After they got tired of raiding all those countries and stuff, they wanted some place that felt kind of Scandinavian, was close to home, and they come back to Gotland here, and they farms all over the island. It was a huge Viking center at the end of the Viking age particularly. It's also a launching point for invasions of Russia earlier. And Visby, the capital of Gotland there, it's a small town really, but it's really, really well preserved. And this is partly because Gotland was important to the Vikings, but no one else. And so after the Viking age was over, the Hanseatic League made it one of their shipping points because it had a lot of shipping history. But then people realized they didn't really need to stop at that island. And so it sort of fell off the map. And after about 1400, even 1200, nothing happened on Gotland. The Vikings just sort of lived there and stayed there. And so the town basically dates to the 1400s, with very little change since then. The old log cabin styles that you see in Russia, by the way, brought there from the Vikings that were here in Gotland. And there they also, in their museum, have a diorama showing what life might have been like. Most of the Vikings couldn't afford to bury their ship on a hill, so they just set up stones in the shape of a ship. And sort of like, this is your poor man's ship burial. And there are lots of these ship burials around Gotland. They also set up a lot of stones. This one, gravestones, and this one is a depiction of Valhalla, which in the Norse mythology was the place where you could battle all day and get wounded and arms cut off and killed, and the next morning you'd wake up whole and be able to do it all again. It's like, this is the dream world. Die every day in battle and then do it again. And again, lots of silver hoards. Even today, people are digging in their garden and come up with a whole pile of silver arm rings and things. But notice the boats in Gotland. This is the same strakes, the same technology as was used in the Oseberg ship, the ship in the hill in Norway. They still use it today, but they have to have the back square so you can put a motor on it. But it's the same style of ships. And there are a lot of fishermen still. These fishing cottages along the shore in Gotland, you can rent. And it's very popular, especially it's only a 2-hour ferry ride from Stockholm. And so you get your little cabin, and a lot of famous Swedes have the fishing cottages where they can go and kick back on Gotland. So now we're back in Stockholm, and I want to take us to northern Norway from here. And to do this, you get on a train that takes about 12 hours to get across Sweden. And it's mostly going through rolling hills. Sweden is not dramatic in the sense of jagged mountains either, usually. And then you switch from the Swedish electric trains that are blue to the Norwegian diesel trains that are red. Right at the border, you get out of one and get on the other. Never the twain shall meet. And then down into Norway, which is very different. Suddenly you have these cliffs and waterfalls and fjords and very dramatic and difficult to live. And then you're in Trondheim. Trondheim is the 3rd largest city in Norway and was founded by Olaf. Olaf was the Viking king who brought Christianity to Norway. And the cathedral there in Trondheim has his bones. And it is sacred for that reason, I suppose. Trondheim, cute town also. People really do dress like this. On Sunday you dress up your kids and everybody go to church. But from Trondheim you can also take this ferry north. Now this is the Hurtigruten, which means the fast route. But it still takes a week to go from Bergen to North Cape. And originally, 100 years ago, this was a lifeline to the fishing villages of the Norwegian Atlantic coast. This is a coast that's cut up by huge fjords and islands everywhere. It's more rugged and remote than Alaska's Panhandle or the Aleutian Islands. And this ferry that would stop, take a week to go all the way up there and then turn around and come all the way back for a week, brought all of their food and supplies and was a way to get from town to town. Well, now it's been made a little fancier. They have a boat every day going each direction, and they are fitted out like cruise ships, but they still have this function of actually carrying supplies from town to town. They are kind of the trains of that area. So after a day and a half sailing north from Trondheim, you get to the Lofoten Islands. These stick out into the Atlantic quite a ways. It's surprising anybody lives there, but it's because the cod fishing is just spectacular there. Even in the Viking age, they would go out to the in summer and set up for the cod runs and then dry the cod, which you see everywhere, dried cod being preserved. Totally a Viking tradition of catching cod, drying it, and preserving it. And you could here also rent one of these little boat cottages. So we got off the ferry for a couple of days and wandered around in the Lofotens, and then got back on the ferry. Here's some of our dried cod up there, the stockfish, and then sailed north for another 2.5 days. And now this is the end of June. It is the longest days of the year, but the sun never goes down. You just don't see it because it's usually cloudy. It rains a bit, and it is often overcast. But as we go further north, the mountains actually get less steep. They're the steepest around the Lofotens. The further north you go, they become a little less steep. This is the view from our porthole in our room on the boat. And here they take the boat up this tiny little fjord and turn it around just to prove they can. Because it's really deep water there, and it's fun, and the tourists love it, and it's not. It takes only a few minutes to go up there and turn around. And here's midnight sun. And now we're getting to some pretty remote towns in the far north. These were all completely destroyed by the Nazis in World War II as they retreated. Every building burned to the ground, so nothing is older than 1946, mostly 1950s. Here we are in Hammersfest, and it's the middle of the night, but who knows? And we've got an hour there on shore, so we rush out and go up here into the heather, and there's a herd of reindeer right on the edge of town. And you have to wear these thick coats. This is July 1st, but you need to wear thick coats. Another day takes you around North Cape and over to the ultimate end of Norway, and this is Kirkenes. Kirkenes is a town of maybe 2,000–3,000 people, stuck right up against the border of Finland and Russia. And there is a common border between Norway and Russia. It's only 20 miles long. But Janelle and I thought, why ride that ferry all the way back? We've seen that. Let's go on and try to investigate the Russian Vikings, because there were Vikings in Russia as well. They founded Russia. So we got business visas for Russia. Don't get a tourist visa, get a business visa. Then you can go anywhere you want for 3 months. And the deal is you have to be invited by a Russian company. But it turns out there are hundreds of these online that will invite you for $100. So it's quite easy. I said I want to research Vikings for my Viking novel, and the Russian Mafia for a book I'm writing about, a thriller about D.B. Cooper. My wife said, maybe you should just leave out the bit about the Russian Mafia there. I said, okay, so we'll just say that we're researching Vikings. So we get on the bus. There is one bus a day from Kirkenes to Murmansk. It's called the Sputnik. It is probably 50 years old. It's full of, it's got a few drunk old men. Everybody is absolutely Russian. Don't speak a word of anything else. There's just a school class in there. And for 5 hours you bump through potholes in the tundra. Go past all this old Cold War barbed wire and installations and missile bases and things, and then wind up in Murmansk, which is a city of 500,000, way above the Arctic Circle. All of those people live in these high rises. And there are no houses. These are their garages. This is where they have their moped, maybe their car, and a few things that they keep. And this was off limits to Westerners until 15 years ago, because it is the base for the Russian Red Navy, the fleet. All the icebreakers go there. In fact, in our hotel, the bar is called the Icebreaker. And it's a strange town, though, because there are no signs. It looks like there's no stores, no houses, nothing you recognize. But you just open a door, and there's usually a sort of an airlock, and then inside is a fabulous restaurant. And in Norway, we were starving because Norway is very expensive. A pizza dinner with a beer is $100. It simply is. It's terribly expensive. We lived on flatbread and goat cheese. Yeah, on the ferries, we didn't even buy the ferry food because it was $130 per person per day, and we just said, well, we'll live on flatbread. So when we got to Moormets and found one of these restaurants and looked at the prices and sort of translated the stuff, and is this really what I think it is? Because it's a 5-course meal with cognac for $10. So we just went nuts. We bought everything. And we only have about 50 words of Russian. You know, my wife studied it a bit, and I learned to phrase things. No one knows anything else other than Russian. But from there is a train. And the train will take you down to St. Petersburg. It takes 2 days and 2 nights. You think the Siberian Railroad is a long trip? Well, this takes 2 days and 2 nights to get to the start of the Siberian Railroad. And you're starting above the Arctic Circle. So we walk in and order a train ticket. With our 50 words of Russian, it's really difficult. One day, and we broke it up into 3 legs. One day our train ticket was like $5. And the next day it was $100. And we just got it and went on. And we realized what's happening here is that we don't know the difference between first class, second class, and third class. And the $5 ticket, there's chickens in there. There is a samovar in every car, and 8 bunks and grandmothers with babushkas and the whole thing. And, this was the $100 day, where we have our own waiter with comes up individually and asks if there's anything we can do. You can do for us. Brings us magazines and things to eat and all of this stuff. So after a day, we stopped and got out because we wanted to see the Solovetsky Islands. This is in the White Sea. It's a monastery you can only get to with another boat ride. It takes another hour. And it was where the old believers were persecuted in the late 1600s. Perhaps you're familiar, in Woodburn, here in Oregon, we have 10,000 people who speak Russian. The old believers, they farm out there and all that. Well, they began here in Russia in 1680, I'm going to say, when the head of the Russian Orthodox Church announced a bunch of changes. They were going to change the rules and make the slash at the bottom of the cross go the other way. They said, well, we can't put up with that. And so they retreated to this island, built this monastery, and were besieged by the army for 10 years and wiped out. Few people had escaped to Siberia, spent 300 years there, then emigrated to Brazil for another 40, and now have come to Oregon. And this now is a United Nations heritage site, I think partly just for the determination of these people for what they believe, the old believers. So our goal here really is to get to Novgorod. Novgorod is a town that was the capital of Viking Russia. A lot of people don't know this, but the word Russia, the concept of Russia, is Swedish. Russia was founded by a man named Rus, who was a Viking from Sweden, in Swedish runic, I guess in Old Norse runic, but the variant of it is Rus. And he saw, they brought their boats in there to Novgorod by taking them up these shallow rivers, and found all these Slavs around there and said, oh, you guys are slaves. That's right. And we're your king. And they founded the first government in this area and built this as their capital. Novgorod means new city. They had an earlier one about 50 miles away, but after 2 years they moved here. So this is the oldest city in Russia, but it's called New City because it was the Viking capital. And it's seen hard times. The Soviet era left this. This is the Palace of Culture in Novgorod, obviously built very poorly. And you know, there's still some. Well, there's a lot of difficulties. There's a lot of poverty. This is a flea market. I found I had to do no work to do my research about the Russian mafia because every man looked like he was in the Russian mafia with a black leather jacket and a bulge, and the women were all dressed to the nines, though. They were like trying to be movie stars or something. But Novgorod itself has a wall all the way around it, and was where they launched their attack on Istanbul. A lot of people don't know this either, but the Swedes not only conquered Russia, but then took their ships up the rivers, dragged them overland to the drainage of the Dnieper, and took them down to the Black Sea, and with 10,000 men attacked Constantinople, the capital of Byzantium, and nearly defeated the entire Eastern Roman Empire. And when that didn't work, they went over and took Sicily. It was a Viking state for hundreds of years. They loved, of course, islands. So Sicily was probably like tropical paradise after coming from Novgorod. And Novgorod, this is called the Kremlin. Every city has its own Kremlin. It just means fortress. But it is a medieval wall around the city. They still have some Russian Orthodox things here. This is part of your... There's a nice museum there, too, that tells the Viking history of Novgorod. Here we are. These are actually Huns attacking off of the steppe. And they were turned back. At this point, they were Christian. With this image, this icon of Mary, this black virgin. And that defeated the Huns. This is what it might have looked like in the Middle Ages in Novgorod. And this is what it looks like now. Because this is the oldest city in Russia and has this big Viking tradition, they have a Viking reenactment there each summer. And people from all over Russia come to play Viking. And a bunch of old, and King Arthur and everything else as well. This is a joust that they're holding there on the bank of the river in Novgorod. And in the back, this is sponsored by root beer. The Russian root beer is called kvasi, or kvas. And so a big sign here says, kvasi, da, yes, root beer. Chimney, yet, chemicals, no. It's all natural root beer. So that's the sort of, that was where the Vikings, the Swedish Vikings went. The Danes mostly went to England. The Norwegians went out into the North Sea and Ireland. And the Swedes typically went toward Russia. But what I found with all of this research is that every culture has a violent side. These are Red Army soldiers in St. Petersburg. But every culture has this dichotomy. It's not just the Vikings. And the Vikings, that Scandinavia was not strictly a violent culture. That is what was exported. And that's what is often thought of. But there is an other side. The other side is the people who stayed home. When the men were out Viking, the country was ruled by women. And it was a different culture, one of peace. And this is one of the things I'm trying to get across in this book, that the most important Viking grave of all time was not for a barbarian warrior, a slash-and-burn person, but rather a woman who is trying to stop them and bring peace, and did. And that is a message that I think is not widely known. But we all know that in our hearts. Anyone with a little bit of Viking heritage knows that. In Sweden, for example, the same man who invented dynamite also invented the Nobel Peace Prize. And in every culture, even here, there is a violent side and a peaceful side, and it's constantly a struggle to see which will overcome, whether we'll let our barbarian nature take hold, or whether this queen and the ship in the hill will eventually prevail. And that's the story that I tell tell in my book, and I do it with kind of alternating chapters between the excavation in 1904 and the Queen 1,000 years earlier, and trying to draw parallels between that to tell two stories at once and get you to the same goal at the end, where women achieve the vote in Norway in 1904, and Asa defeats the Vikings 1,000 years before. And that's my talk. Yes, if you have questions, I would be glad to answer them. Yes?
What's the relationship between the burial grounds at Sutton Hoo and the Viking?
Well, this was already brought up. Sutton Hoo is over 100 years earlier. It's probably about 200 years before this ship. And so even though you're dealing with raiders from Denmark and Anglia and whatnot, it's more Anglo-Saxon. So I wouldn't kind of categorize those as Vikings. The Viking raids I would categorize as starting about 793. The ones coming from Norway, certainly that is the date for the ones coming from Norway, which were, and you know, the word Viking comes from Norway. Near Larvik is a little fjord called Vik. Larvik means lower Vik, and Vik just means bay. And the people who came from the Vik were the Vikings. So to me that says that the Viking, the name, the concept really came from that part of Norway, which is where the ship was found. It was found right there in the Vik. Yes?
When you talk of the Viking, there's a lot down through the various areas of the Slavics and Great Britain. What started it? I mean, you were talking 20,000 men would be sometimes partaking.
What started?
Had to get an idea of, gee, there's something down south that we should probably go see.
What started the Viking raids? And that's a good question. It really was, you know, every culture also has some young restless men who are looking for fame and fortune and maybe a little bit of excitement. One shipload, a couple shiploads, found the Lindisfarne Monastery in northern England. It was defended by monks with a vow of non-violence. There was no defense at all of this, and it was filled with gold. Chalices, crosses, Bible covers. It was like walking into taking candy from a baby. And they took the monks back too. And so they had monks, all this gold, and came back and said, look what we got. We got slaves, gold, and people, it didn't take long for this to catch on. Word spread, but mostly among this volatile, young, male contingent that was maybe like the third son and wasn't going to get the farm, and here's a quick way, you build a boat, see what happens. And then it started getting organized, and you'd have whole kings that would launch fleets and go out and take Paris and Toulouse and attack entire islands and cities. Yes?
Notice in the recreated Viking slide at the very beginning, it looked like some of the warriors were women.
Yeah, right.
Okay, is this a modern thing, or
Yeah.
were there in fact Viking warrior women?
Not intentionally. But now women get into this reenactment stuff just as much as the men. They don't usually choose a battle axe or a sword, but more often like bows and arrows or dagger or something, and more often get into just the trading and being part of that lifestyle. But in fact, there weren't really, I don't know of any Viking women that were warriors. Any other questions? Okay, thank you all.
Okay.